First, we have Alec Goldstone, who was the legislative assistant with Congressman Jim Langevin of the 2nd District of Rhode Island. Congressman Langevin is the primary sponsor of the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act in the U.S. House of Representatives, and Alec is a legislative assistant for the congressman. His portfolio includes health and disability policy, as well as transportation, infrastructure, energy, and environmental issues. He started working for Representative Langevin in June of 2020, and has been in his current role since June of 2021. We're also privileged to be joined by Heather Ansley, who was the Associate Executive Director of Government Relations of Paralyzed Veterans of America. Heather's responsibilities include managing the efforts of PBA on Capitol Hill and working with the administration to promote legislation and policies that ensure veterans with catastrophic disabilities receive the health care and benefits that they have earned and the civil rights protections that they deserve. They also work to promote collaboration between disability organizations and veteran service organizations, and currently serves as the immediate past chair of the Consortium for Constituents with Disabilities and on the board of the Disability Rights Bar Association. So again, we're very pleased to be joined tonight by both Heather and Alec. Right now, we are going to hear remarks that have been prepared by Congressman Langevin, who again is the sponsor of the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act in the U.S. House of Representatives.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Congressman Jim Langevin, and I proudly represent the 2nd Congressional District of Rhode Island. I'd like to start by thanking the Muscular Dystrophy Association for inviting me to take part in this month's MDA Advocacy Institute, which is focused on accessible air travel. Now, this is such an important topic, and I'm really glad that you're taking the time to raise awareness about this issue, because we must absolutely advocate for meaningful change. Look, there are millions of people with disabilities out there striving to live independent lives, and we need to do whatever we can to support them. This includes making sure that air travel is accessible and available to everyone. Now, as co-chair of the Bipartisan Disabilities Caucus and the first quadriplegic ever elected to Congress, addressing this issue is not only among my top priorities, but it's also very personal to me. For nearly 22 years, I've been flying back and forth between my home in Warwick, Rhode Island, and my congressional office in Washington, D.C. That's a 700-mile round trip almost every week. Now, at the start of the pandemic, and out of an abundance of caution, I was making this trek by car, riding in my van for 8 grueling hours each direction, which served as a reminder that there's really no way that I could do my job in a practical manner without accessible air travel. So for 35 years, the Air Carrier Access Act has prohibited airlines from discriminating against people with disabilities. Yet even with this protection, travelers with disabilities still encounter significant barriers when they fly commercial. So this includes damaged assistive devices and wheelchairs, delayed assistance, poor communication, and a lack of accessible seating accommodations, all things that I've personally experienced. Now, the status quo is absolutely unacceptable. People with disabilities must have equal access to the skies, which is why I've been working on this issue for several years now. And I'm very pleased that many of my efforts have so far been successful. For example, back in 2018, I secured language in the law that reauthorized the Federal Aviation Administration, which created a Bill of Rights for airline passengers with disabilities. That was a step in the right direction, but there's still so much more that we need to do, which is why I introduced the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. So this bill would direct the Access Board to issue updated standards for new aircraft and order the removal of access barriers on existing planes. It would also require the Department of Transportation to assess civil penalties when airlines violate the rights of passengers with disabilities and refer cases that reflect a pattern of discrimination to the Department of Justice for further investigation. Additionally, it would establish a private right of action for air travelers with disabilities whose rights are violated, allowing them to have their day in court to enforce the law. In general, the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act lays out some necessary steps in the direction of making air travel fully accessible and inclusive for all. So please trust that I'll continue working with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to advance this important legislation. It's one of my top priorities before I retire from Congress at the end of this term. However, I certainly can't do this alone. To get this bill across the finish line, I'm going to need all of your help. So if you support the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, please contact your senators and representatives to let them know. You can all write or even email them. You can even ask for a meeting in person to share your experience and explain how this bill would help. So these are the interactions that break the status quo and drive change. So with that, I just want to thank you again for including me in this event. I encourage all of you to keep up the great work, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the program.
Thank you, Congressman, for the great words. Now we're going to hear from the Congressman's legislative assistant, Alec Goldstone, who's going to go into more detail about the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. Alec?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for the introduction and for the bio before. But I also want to thank the Muscular Dystrophy Association for inviting me to participate tonight, and also just for your interest and your commitment to improving the accessibility of air travel. You know, as the Congressman pointed out, this is such an important issue. It affects so many people, and there are so many things that need to change here. So, just a little bit about me. As Michael said, I am Alec. I am Congressman Jim Langevin's legislative assistant that handles health and disability issues primarily, as well as issues pertaining to transportation, infrastructure, and a long list of things we don't need to get into tonight. But it's been an honor and privilege to work for Congressman Langevin because of the way that he works on these issues. I mean, he cares so deeply. He wants to make real change. And that's why for years, based on his personal experience and the experience that constituents, the experience that advocates have brought to him, he's been working on this issue to make air travel more accessible. And I know he's worked very closely over the years with Heather as well and Paralyzed Veterans of America. So, he's always appreciated that partnership as well, and the work together to drive this change. As he mentioned, the Air Carrier Access Act, which became law back in the 80s, was a great step in the right direction, and it really helped tamp down a lot of the discrimination in air travel. But people with disabilities and mobility impairments still face discrimination when they travel with commercial airlines nowadays, despite that law being in effect. And that's why, as Congressman Langevin said, he's been working on these issues for years to try to tighten up the law and around this to make sure that people with disabilities are not discriminated against when they travel. Most recently, that's why he's introduced this current version of the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. This bill, it hits at this issue from several angles. So for one thing, it spells out a list of explicitly prohibited actions on the part of airlines. It basically tries to make it clearer that there are some actions that broadly described that can so clearly be considered discrimination if an airline commits them, and can make sure that the airline can be held accountable for committing them. On the flip side of that, it also lists a bunch of broad requirements with which airlines have to comply in order to also not be discriminating. So, we think that's very important to make that clear and not just leave a vague description of discrimination, as is the case in the current Air Carrier Access Act. Some examples of these things that airlines must do: they must provide services in the most integrated setting. They need to make reasonable modifications, things along those lines. A lot of it is they need to be acting in good faith to not be discriminating and make sure that people with disabilities are receiving a fair treatment when they travel with commercial air travel. So, moving on from that, another thing that this bill does is it requires the Department of Transportation to always make sure that there's an accessible way for people with disabilities to file complaints that they have with airlines, to file these complaints with the department. And then further, it requires the department to investigate each one of these complaints, to take every complaint seriously, as should be expected, and investigate them thoroughly and determine whether or not the airlines have committed some form of discrimination. And importantly, if it is found that they have, this bill would also require the Department of Transportation to assess civil penalties against those airlines for their bad behavior and their discrimination and their violations of the law. But another thing that it does on this note is it requires the Department of Transportation to further refer patterns of discrimination that it finds in its investigations to the Department of Justice, so that the Department of Justice can investigate these patterns further. I don't want to discount that one-off incidents of discrimination are okay or should be excused. They are unacceptable. But it becomes even more concerning when we start to see patterns and practices that are, by nature, discriminatory. And that's why it's so important that the Department of Justice needs to get involved in these particular incidents when the Department of Transportation sees a pattern, to make sure that these airlines, air carriers, can be held accountable for this behavior. So moving on to the next section. This bill would establish a private right of action for people with disabilities whose rights are violated when they travel with commercial air travel. In other words, this would give people with disabilities the opportunity to take airlines to court to enforce the law, to have their day in court, to hold airlines accountable for acts of discrimination. Now, this is not something that is currently allowed. It is not included under the current Air Carrier Access Act. And we want to put that in. We want to make sure that that's always an option. In addition to tamping down on discrimination and practices, this bill would also do some work to try to make physical accessibility better on airplanes. So, for example, it would require the U.S. Access Board to come up with standards to address new airplanes, for example, new standards for accessibility, which would involve things like accessible lavatories, seating accommodations, things along those lines, but also standards to address effective boarding and processes for getting off of airplanes. These things really need to be done. As we build new airplanes, we can't be building them with inaccessible standards. It just doesn't make sense. Recognizing that a lot of existing airplanes are also inaccessible, this bill also requires the U.S. Access Board to come up with standards for removing existing barriers on airplanes that are currently in operation. Now, we recognize that these can't be the same standards as those promulgated for new airplanes, because there are just certain things about existing aircraft that very likely cannot be adjusted. But we can make some progress there, and we need to, quite frankly. This bill also, it does some work to ensure that all gates and counters, ticketing areas, things along those lines, customer service desks, make sure that they are also accessible because air travel is about more than just being on the airplane and getting on the airplane or getting off the airplane or the way that assistive devices are stored. It's about the entire process from the time that someone arrives at the airport to the time they leave. So this bill tries to address that as well. And all in all, we want to move this package of changes forward, and our hope is to get this marked up by the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee at some point this year, so that we can get it to the House floor and move it on. This is many years in the works, these processes, this bill, and it's the congressman's intent and it's his hope to make progress and move this forward before he retires. But I can guarantee you that if by some chance this is not law by the first day that he's no longer in Congress, he will absolutely make sure that there is another member of Congress to carry the torch in 2023 when he's no longer here. This is not something that ends with him, with the end of his term. But I'd say, overall, to move this process along, to help us get this bill marked up by the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, to help us get this bill to the House floor, we need as much support as we can get. I mean, it's always better to have more members of Congress co-sponsoring a bill. It sends a signal to leadership. It sends a signal to committee chairs. It sends these signals even to other branches of government that this is where members of Congress are. This is where their constituents want them to be. So like the congressman said in his remarks, if you support this bill and what it seeks to do, you should really contact your senators and representatives. And if you find out that they're already co-sponsors of the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act, that's great. And you should push them even farther, push them to address other issues that you care about. But if they're not, you should strongly encourage them to co-sponsor this bill. You can, like the congressman said, you can call their offices, you can write them letters, you can write them emails, you can ask to meet with them, whatever you can do to make your voice heard, to get your position across, to let them know what's important to you. And I'll tell you, just as an anecdote, as someone who used to handle the incoming mail for our office and sort through all of that to make sure that it was all getting to the right places, I can tell you that when we get a lot of support for certain bills, it absolutely moves the needle. The Congressman Langevin, for one, I can only speak to his practices here. He cares what his constituents have to say. And when he hears that constituents want him to support a certain effort, he very, very strongly considers it. And with all the bills floating around in Congress, sometimes a member of Congress is not a co-sponsor, not by choice, but because they just haven't been made aware of the opportunity to support it. So there is always, always value in reaching out to your members of Congress and asking them to support issues like this. So, if you support this bill and you support, what I'm discussing, what Congressman Langevin talked about, and what you research on your own about what this bill seeks to do, I encourage you to take advantage of all these processes to get in touch with your members of Congress and push for this. Let them know how you feel. Let them know if you want them to support this bill or even other efforts to make air travel more accessible. I'm unfortunately going to have to jump off this call because we are in the middle of our appropriations season and I have to get to other work before I can go home. But I want to thank everyone again for your engagement with this issue and your work on this, and to the Muscular Dystrophy Association for inviting me tonight. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you, Michael, but thank you all.
Thank you, Alec. And I know we have 4 questions in the chat. We do have time built in at the end for questions, and Heather and I will do our best to answer them. So next we have Heather Ansley, the Associate Executive Director for Government Affairs and Paralyzed Veterans of America. Heather has been working on the ACAAA for several years now, and we're very pleased to have her with us to fill us in tonight. Heather?
Well, thank you, Michael, and good evening or afternoon, depending on where you are across the world. I guess could be morning. My name is Heather Ansley, as Michael previously said, and I'm honored to have the opportunity this evening to be on this webinar and talk with you about improving access to air travel for people with disabilities. Just a brief visual description. I am a white woman with brown hair, sort of straight and short. I wear brown glasses, and I have on a pink button-down shirt and a gray jacket. So Paralyzed Veterans of America is a congressionally chartered veterans service organization, and all of our members are veterans who have a spinal cord injury or a disorder such as MS or ALS. And improving access to everyday life is something that we have focused on for our 75 years as an organization, and access to air travel has been really integral to that effort. Next slide, please. So PVA has been involved in the effort to improve access to air travel for over 40 years. In the mid-1980s, we filed a lawsuit that went to the United States Supreme Court seeking access to air travel under Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. That was the law that says if you're the federal government or you have federal money, you can't discriminate against people with disabilities. This was, of course, before we had the Americans with Disabilities Act. We said, well, a lot of money, a lot of federal investment goes into air travel, and so perhaps they should have some requirements under that law to be accessible. Prior to that, you could buy a ticket, show up, be ready to fly, and you could be told at the gate that you would not be allowed to travel because you are too disabled to do so. And it wasn't illegal to be told that. So we knew we had to do something. Unfortunately, the Supreme Court didn't see the law our way and decided that 504 didn't give the protections that we wanted. So thankfully, we had former Senator Bob Dole, a Republican from Kansas, who did introduce the Air Carrier Access Act. And within the span of 3 months, it was signed into law. That is record speed for a civil rights law. So back in 1986, President Reagan signed this. And the law, it predates the Americans with Disabilities Act. So it does, as was said, prohibit disability-based discrimination in air travel. And the requirements are laid out in the regulations that were developed by the Department of Transportation. I did see in the excuse me, in the Q&A, there were some questions about why doesn't the ADA apply to air travel? That's probably a question for those that were there negotiating it. But what I can tell you is, unfortunately, the ADA explicitly excludes commercial air travel. So air travel is the only, we'll say, mode of mass transportation that's not covered by the ADA. And I think probably the reason was the Air Carrier Access Act had passed in '96, 4 years earlier, and the regulations came out in 1990. So folks, I think thought, okay, we've already got air travel taken care of. We're fighting so many other battles to try to get ADA across the finish line. Let's just call that one. Hope we've taken care of that one. We'll just go on and, you know, get all the rest of the forms of transportation and everything else. Well, of course, as the law and the years have passed by, we've seen that ADA has done a much better job of making other forms of transportation accessible than the Air Carrier Access Act has. The protections, though, that are available, you know, that you can't just be excluded boarding as you could in the past. You're allowed to pre-board, they're supposed to provide timely assistance in boarding and deplaning, supposed to stow the wheelchair, and then give appropriate seating accommodations. Now, we know that many times this is a very difficult thing that people have to do, something as simple as traveling by air. So last October was the 35th anniversary of the passage of the Air Carrier Access Act. And in order to really learn more about the current experience of air travelers, even during a pandemic, we decided to work with other disability organizations, including MVA, to do a survey that would help us understand the current air travel experience of passengers with disabilities, all kinds of disabilities. The survey was held October through December of last year, And we had about 1,200 individuals, almost 1,300, who did take the survey. Again, it covered a wide variety of accommodations for passengers with disabilities. And, you know, interestingly, according to the survey, many of our respondents had flown in the past 12 to 24 months, which really was that COVID time period, peaking on a little bit back to 2019. We also had about 9% who said they don't fly. Of course, can be any number of reasons why people choose not to fly, but the consensus from these passengers seemed to be that for those who use wheelchairs and do not travel was because it's simply too difficult and the risk is too great to their health because of the physical inaccessibility of the aircraft, improper assistance in boarding and deplaning, and then the possibility that your wheelchair is going to be damaged, lost, delayed. Although there were, and like I said, there were a lot of people in the survey who say we do travel, but we asked those who responded to tell us if there were reasons that they might try to avoid air travel. Maybe they would decide to fly or to drive or take a train instead of fly. So we had about 1,000 survey respondents, you know, many who answered that question. Many were overwhelmingly concerned with physical barriers that they might encounter. So we had just some examples of things that people chose, reasons why they might not travel. Their personal safety and transferring from their wheelchair to an aisle chair and into the aircraft seat. 54% said we might avoid air travel when we can because of that. Not being able to use the lavatory or the restroom. 64% said that might be a reason not to travel by air. And then potential damage to your wheelchair, 74% said that made them think twice about deciding to travel by air. Additional comments focused on problems with getting proper seating accommodations, and of course, because of COVID, anxiety about flying during the pandemic and the potential health issues. Next slide, please. So barriers people with disabilities face are not really, we don't feel like fully addressed by the Air Carrier Access Act or regulated by the Department of Transportation. There are very few accessibility requirements in the law. Two that come to mind are if you're flying on a twin aisle aircraft, usually these days that means you're flying somewhere overseas. There's a requirement to have one wheelchair accessible lavatory on that plane. Another accessibility feature, if you will, is that 50% of aisle armrests are supposed to be able to be lowered so that a way you can make an easier transfer from the aisle chair into the passenger seat. That's about it. When you think about accessibility features on buses and subways and even Amtrak, there's not much going on an airplane to try to make it easier. Also, we talked about there's no private right of action. So when you encounter a problem, the solution is to file a complaint with the Department of Transportation or file a complaint with the airline. And if you file a complaint with DOT, you know that even if they find that your rights were violated and that the Air Carrier Access Act was violated, there's nothing they can do for you personally. You're not going to get any refunds, money. You'll get a letter in the mail that says basically you were right, and that they're going to send the letter to the airline and tell them, please don't do this again. If you file something with the airline, you may get miles. That is something people frequently get, and many times I say that's the last thing they want because they don't necessarily want to fly again, maybe even on that airline, maybe at all. So it's very difficult to get grievances met. With that said, I will say, if you encounter issues in air travel, please, please, please take the time to file a complaint with DOT. It's fairly easy to do. You can do it online. You can do it right there at the airport. When you're waiting to get the problem resolved, you can pull up your phone if you've got one of those and file your complaint. And the reason it's important to file those complaints, even if you may not get a lot of, satisfaction out of the response, is that that's what airlines and DOT looks at is, well, how many complaints are we getting? And they like to say, well, if we're not getting a lot of complaints, then maybe that means, everything's okay. And I know I've talked to a lot of our members who have filed so many complaints over the years that they just, they feel like it doesn't change anything. They get tired of filing them. But I can tell you, it's used against us a lot. So if you're willing, if you're able, please do file a complaint with DOT so that they know that this time, you know, that for this particular flight, something went wrong. Of course, we feel like the best way to improve access is Congress is going to have to act and pass legislation. So the next slide really goes into some of what we've already discussed, which is just the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act. And I will also implore that please do contact your House and Senate members, your congressmen, your senators, and let them know that you want them to support this bill. We have 39, go to the next slide, please. We have 39 co-sponsors in the House. We've been adding a good number of co-sponsors since last fall. And we really want more, because the more we have, the more it shows, as was said, not only other Congress people, but also the Department of Transportation and the airlines and others, that this is something that's starting to get serious. There's traction behind this. So please do take the time to weigh in and let your members know that you want them to support this legislation. And we are hearing that because unfortunately Mr. Langevin is going to be retiring, that the committee is looking to, you know, maybe do something with this legislation this year, and the more support that can be shown, the better. In the Senate, we have Senator Tammy Baldwin, who has been the champion. Senator Tammy Duckworth from Illinois, who is a combat veteran, uses a wheelchair, is also a co-sponsor of this legislation. And the way in which a lot of air travel legislation has moved recently is through the reauthorization of the FAA. That is scheduled to take place in 2023. So there will be a package in 2023 in the Senate Commerce Committee, which is where they have jurisdiction on this in the Senate, is beginning to collect ideas and thoughts for that next bill. So we have some opportunities between possibly moving the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act as a standalone, but also to be able to move it as part of the FAA Reauthorization Act. Through the great work of Congressman Langevin and Senator Baldwin and Senator Duckworth and many others, bipartisan, we were able to get an entire section on disability in the last authorization, which has led to a lot more conversations on disability, a lot of efforts working with DOT that, you know, we're still hopeful will have some lead to some improvements in the process, even though I can tell you from our members' perspective, I do know that travel has gotten even more difficult coming out of the pandemic. Next slide. So of course there are things going on besides the legislation. And one of those is the Department of Transportation is doing some work. And back in 2016, they held what's called a negotiated rulemaking on 3 different issues. And one of them was whether or not lavatories on single-aisle aircraft should be accessible for wheelchair users. So as part of this negotiation, disability, airline, aircraft manufacturers, literally met in hotel rooms around Washington, D.C., and tried to negotiate an agreement that would lead to accessible lavatories on single-aisle aircraft. PBA has been involved in this conversation literally since the start of the, since this law was passed. They've been having these discussions about whether or not single-aisle aircraft should have accessible lavatories. And in the beginning, twin-aisle aircraft flew more within the United States. So maybe going coast to coast, you might be on a twin aisle and have access to the lavatory. Well, that's changed a lot. And now the vast majority of flights are on single-aisle aircraft, which is somewhat what has helped push this conversation forward. And so there was an agreement, a short-term agreement, one agreement to try to make any improvements that could be made as quickly as possible. And then a longer term agreement that would eventually lead to accessible lavatories. The best that the airlines would agree to was 18 years after they order a plane for whenever the regulation goes into effect, or 20 years delivered, or a year after they create a brand new, what they call clean sheet aircraft, which is something that's not a 737 or something that doesn't even exist. They would have an accessible lavatory. So the Department of Transportation finally put out the proposed rule on the short-term improvements back in early 2020. And we were still waiting for a final rule on that one. In the fall of 2021, the agency decided that they needed to get more information about the onboard wheelchair, which we all agree is a pretty important part of being able to reach the lavatory. They're now saying that they're going to put out a final rule on the short-term opportunities by this December. Hopefully they'll make that date. After years of delay, 6 years almost, DOT did just recently publish the notice of proposed rulemaking for an actual accessible lavatory on a single-aisle aircraft. The ability to go into the lavatory on an onboard wheelchair with someone to assist you if that's what you need, and close the door and use the lavatory like other passengers do. The comments that are due, so DOT is looking for comments, not only on the rule itself, but also whether the timeline that was agreed to should be shortened. And we really want them to get a lot of comments from a lot of people with disabilities and those who, their families and friends and caregivers, to say that we need access to lavatories on a single-aisle aircraft as soon as possible. That equity demands that people with disabilities have access. There are accessible lavatories, so it's not like it has to be invented. It's more of a matter of airlines haven't really adopted these for a variety of reasons, typically related to losing seats, and losing seats means lost revenue. So we want to make sure they hear from people that this is really important, and also to make sure you let them know what not having access to a laboratory means for your health, for your dignity, all of those things that are sometimes hard to put a dollar figure on, but are really, really important for them to consider when they're deciding what to do with this legislation. I'm sorry, this particular rule. Next slide. So the Department of Transportation also held a public meeting on March 24th regarding the experience specifically of wheelchair users in air travel. And this meeting really came from a lot of outcry from the death of Ingracia Figueroa, who had her wheelchair destroyed after flying back from Washington doing advocacy, and ended up with injuries by not having access to her chair that she lost her life. And that and other advocacy really showed the department they needed to do something. And so they had this all-day meeting to learn more about these experiences and kind of figure out what are they going to do. Specifically looked at wheelchairs that are, what happens when a wheelchair is damaged, when it's delayed, or it's lost. In airline terms, that means it was, quote, mishandled, if any of those three things happened. The other part is what happens to the passenger in the boarding and deplaning process, having to use that aisle chair, maybe being lifted and moved by contract workers. I know PVA members have been dropped, they've had broken bones. It's not a pleasant experience many times. So we wanted to highlight those issues. And the Secretary Pete Buttigieg, stated that DOT will be taking actions to make improvements for passengers who use wheelchairs. PVA put in a notice of proposed rule. We can't do notices. We put in a request for DOT to make rules regarding wheelchair damage, and also training of those who are assisting people with disabilities. So we're hopeful that there will be some action on this soon. They took comments up until Monday of this week. So stay tuned for more about what they're going to do. And then my final slide is on in-cabin wheelchair restraints, or flying from your wheelchair. And I know that we have some participants on the call today who are some of the experts on this particular issue and the work that is being done. But back in, I mentioned that FAA reauthorization. So back in 2018, we advocated for a provision to get included that required the U.S. Access Board to do a study on the feasibility of flying in your wheelchair. We wanted to address the technical feasibility to get that off the table. So yes, we could determine it is, or it isn't, we'll say it is, And then from there, it's kind of like the lavatory. It's getting it implemented. It's the business case and model for getting it to be a requirement. And of course, there are many wheelchair users who would like to be able to fly in their wheelchairs. For some, it's the hope that the chair won't be damaged or lost and that they will not be injured in the boarding or deplaning process. Others need the support that their wheelchair provides to them, and they simply aren't able to fly from a typical passenger seat. So in September of 2021, the U.S. Access Board held a public briefing on the results of a study of installing these wheelchair restraint systems in the passenger aircraft. And the study was conducted by the Transportation Research Board. And the study was, the good news about the study is they were unable, quote, I'm going to quote this, to identify any issues that seem likely to present design and engineering challenges so formidable that they call into question the technical feasibility of an in-cabin wheelchair restraint system and the value of exploring the concept further. So basically, they decided, we're not seeing the red flags. We think this can move forward. Now, they did acknowledge that they need to do some further assessments to understand how secured wheelchairs are likely to perform relative to FAA's security criteria in restraining and protecting occupants during a survivable airplane crash or an emergency landing. And they called on the Department of Transportation and the FAA to undertake research on that issue and others. They also called on the Access Board to assess the demand from passengers with disabilities to fly in their wheelchair to determine if that would be the way to figure out how many aircraft would need to be modified to provide meaningful access to passengers with disabilities. So this is a great step forward to have this report. We are urging the Department of Transportation to move forward with the next steps to keep this conversation going, and know that there are other groups who are also really taking the lead on this and doing the same. So with that, I know we have a lot of questions, and I will stop.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was some great information. Before we do go to questions, we do have an action alert on our website at www.mda.org/advocacy. We ask that you submit comments to the DOT on the proposed accessible laboratory rule, and also urge the lawmakers to co-sponsor the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act. So we very much encourage you, and we put the link in the chat box to where you can submit your comment to the DOT. Heather, the first question that we do have is, are there any other countries that have better access and better requirements to accommodate people with disabilities and accessible air travel?
Well, that's a good question, Michael, and it is definitely something that's evolving. I know that we've worked some with the Canadian Transportation Agency. They've been doing work on wheelchair damage. They do have some provisions, I believe, that have recently gone into effect, and some of them are better than the Air Carrier Access Act. The European Union also does have provisions related to accessibility. The UK has a lot of advocates in particular who are working on improving access to air travel. There are different models in how services are provided. In the United States, it's the responsibility of the airline. In some countries, it's the responsibility of the airport. So it can be a difference between the various countries. I can say that there is an initiative to look at wheelchair damage that the International Air Transport Association is leading with airports and airlines from around the world, and including advocacy groups. So we're getting to talk with some of our European counterparts, and PBA is glad to be on that group and hear from both what's happening in the US, but also really around the world, and the challenges that are different, because not only do you look at air travel, but also the ADA does, and 504 do apply to the airport. And of course, there are some parts of the world where that's not the case. So there are different challenges sometimes that can happen.
Great. Is the one question we have from Chris, do we have any sort of timeline that we foresee when passengers will be able to fly in the wheelchairs?
So that's also a good question, Michael. I know tomorrow is not soon enough, and it's really hard to say when. I can tell you that advocates, I believe, feel like it's going to be sooner than the airlines do, just from the conversations I have had, and that it is something we're all working for. That's why we need to continue to satisfy all of the technical requirements. And I kind of draw a parallel between lavatories. So we have the ability right now to have accessible lavatories. You'll still have to, get to it using the onboard wheelchair if you need, if you're not able to ambulate. But they exist, and an airline can put them on their plane. Right now, we don't have commercial air travel with people, locking in with their wheelchair and flying. So we need to have that question of, can this happen? Can it be done? And once we've got that resolved, then it becomes the fight we have with lavatories, which is, how do we then get it implemented? How do we get airlines in their various business models to incorporate this? Because we think it would help not only them, because they can load more quickly if people can now just drive on and hook into the locking system, but also it would be much safer for the passenger and for his or her wheelchair. I can say I've talked to some of our PBA members who told me that back in the 80s, they flew in their manual chairs in airplanes. It's not something that wasn't safe. It violated a lot of safety laws because they weren't strapped in any way, shape, or form. They were just sitting sideways in their chair against the bulkhead. But it has happened. So we do think that in the great work I know Michelle Irwin and All Wheels Up is doing in this effort, and a lot of other groups. We're going to continue to support that and push the conversation, but we're also working on what can be done today. What can we do today to make travel better while we work toward that, hopefully not too far in the distant, future, being able to just do like you do on every other mode of transportation, get on and go.
Exactly. Another question we have from Amanda is some of her good challenges with air travel come in the instances of handoff between the curbside drop-off, the airport wheelchair assistance, TSA, and the air carriers. Would this legislation or any of this regulatory action address the poor coordination between all those various players?
So I would say, so there is the Air Carrier Access Advisory Act that was set up to advise the Secretary of Transportation about issues that people with disabilities face. And one of the issues that was discussed many times was the assistance that people receive, that sometimes it's difficult at the airport, to find the assistance, even to get into the building. Once you're in, the handoffs, we know going through TSA can be difficult. TSA, and when you go through the airport, you're kind of in a minefield of which law applies. So when you go into the airport, you're under ADA, either Title II or Title III, and maybe 504 if there's federal money. When you get to TSA, they're not covered by the ADA, so you're only under 504. And then when you get to the airplane, you're only under the Air Carrier Access Act. So you have three laws that could apply during your just at the airport experience. So a lot of those problems we're trying to address through current processes and procedures. Some of the regulations that they're looking at related to, in particular, wheelchair users may address some of that. The law would address it in terms of enforcement, requiring if the proper handoffs aren't happening, to be able to actually file a complaint that might do something. But we feel like right now the mechanisms are there, they're just not being adhered to. But we definitely understand and know that that is a problem.
We have a question from Mo, whether or not the bill will include any requirement for the training of airline personnel to handle motorized wheelchair properly to avoid damages. We do know that the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act would include the requirement for training. We also heard the Secretary Buttigieg said that the DOT would be putting forth regulations in the coming weeks or months that would begin to, correct me if I'm incorrect, Heather, begin to levy fines on airlines for damaging a broken wheelchair. Is that correct?
Yes, there are. So in the last FAA reauthorization, we tripled the fines that could be put on an airline for breaking wheelchairs. The problem is DOT doesn't assess any fines against the airlines. So this legislation would say if an incident happens, you must assess the penalty. So we've increased the penalties, but trying to get enforcement out of the Department of Transportation for a number of years has been difficult.
Okay. We have another question from Greg. We heard about why the ADA doesn't apply to the airline. Why doesn't it apply to the Transportation Security Administration?
So that's also a good question. So the ADA only applies to state and local governments and to public accommodations like hotels and shopping centers and all that good stuff. Because TSA is a federal entity, ADA doesn't apply because it doesn't apply to any of the federal government. So the law that does apply to TSA is Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is older. It's 17 years older than the ADA, and does include requirements that TSA is supposed to follow as it relates to passengers with disabilities. And if you encounter a problem with TSA, you can also file a complaint against them directly with the agency. And that is something that we would encourage people to do if they have problems.
Great, thanks. And we have another one. Is there any information or any updates regarding traveling on an aircraft with a ventilator?
I am not aware of any changes that have happened in the last several years related to ventilators. So that has, I believe, there was, I'm trying to remember, there may be something about a proposed rule that DOT may put out. I honestly can't recall off the top of my head, but I'm not aware of any specific changes that have happened in the last 3 or 4 years.
Greg, if you could put the email and a private message in the chat box, we can look into that for you and get back to you on that. And last question, has PVA met with Boeing or Airbus to get them on board with the proposed rules? And also, will the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act apply to international travel or airlines that are traveling into the United States?
So I'll answer that last question first about how the law applies by saying when Air Carrier Access Act was first passed, it only applied to domestic air travel. And back in, I think it was 2000, they expanded it so that if a flight is coming from or to the United States, then the Air Carrier Access Act applies. If you're going between 2 other countries or within a separate country, it does not apply. You would be under whatever that country's laws are. The second piece about working with aircraft manufacturers, through the work that we did with the negotiated rulemaking and other efforts, we certainly have had many conversations with them. We have also been fortunate, again, to work with others such as All Wheels Up that have been taking some of the laboring ore on meeting with those particular industries. But we certainly have had a lot of conversations with them and know that we know that they can build a lot of different things, and it's what the airline will ultimately decide that they're going to put in their plane. That is where we have to have the feasibility and does it exist, and then the next step is, okay, now will the airline buy it? And lavatories is just a good example, and we really are wanting to continue that conversation because this will only get better, number one, if the airlines acknowledge that the experience of people with disabilities is a problem, and they don't all acknowledge that. So that's a reason why we urge you to file those complaints. But also, we know that many times we have several decades of history that shows us that air travel, the only time we have advancements is when the Department of Transportation says, or Congress says, you will do something. And that's why we really need you to weigh in on the Air Carrier Access Amendments Act and also let DOT know about lavatory access.
Okay. Michelle Irwin from All Wheels Up wants to know, when will the Passengers with Disabilities Bill of Rights that Congressman Langevin talked about, is that publicly available? And also let me see here. The training classes that the airlines and airport personnel will take on how to safely handle wheelchairs. Do we know what these classes will be accredited? Are the instructors going to be certified? Do the attendees, if you're a ramp agent, do you get any sort of certificate for completing that training?
So that's also a good question, a couple of good questions there. One, the Passenger with Disabilities Bill of Rights Department of Transportation, it's in their hands now. The Air Carrier Access Act Advisory Committee reviewed and commented on the department's, their proposed Bill of Rights. There is information that's in the docket for the Air Carrier Access Advisory Committee. That is the only public information that is available about the Bill of Rights that I'm aware of at this time. It is that they are supposed to be moving forward with, the next steps, which should include, letting the public at large have the opportunity to comment, but we haven't received any updates on where they are with that.
Okay.
In terms of training, the training is, as far as we know, because we don't really get a lot of visibility on actual what's there, is that the airlines, do review somewhat the training that the many times contract agents get. Contract agencies put their training together. They may give some kind of internal certificates, something like that. I know I've personally done wheelchair training of agents, and we didn't provide them with any kind of certificate, but it's possible that their airline, they probably noted they got trained because they are required to meet training requirements, but what type of training may be a bit of a different question. So yeah, the conversation about training and whether or not it's adequate quality is an ongoing conversation.
Gotcha. Well, thank you so much, Heather, for joining us tonight. That was a lot of excellent information. Thank you again also to Alec and Congressman Landon, and also to all of you all who took time out of your evening to join us for this Advocacy Institute. Greg, if you can't figure out how to do private message on chat, you can send us your question at advocacy@mdausa.org. And if you want to get more involved in advocacy with MDA, we encourage you to join our advocacy network, www.mda.org/advocacy, or you can text MDAUSA to 50457, and you'll get a link sent right to your phone to join our advocacy network. Thank you again. We're right at 8 o'clock, and we hope you will submit comments to the DOT on the accessible laboratory rule, and also engage with your member of Congress on the Air Carrier Access Amendment Act that we heard about tonight. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening, everyone.